Welcome to this debate hosted by the Zurich Salon, which is a debating organization in Zurich founded in 2014 by my father. He left for England with my mother and the dog, so they're gone. I'm now in charge since the beginning of this year, basically. And what the Salon aims to do is to rekindle the Enlightenment spirit of free and open debate, without any ifs or buts in terms of free speech. So we cover everything, any topic, such as this one right here, which is about the war in Ukraine. Now, as to myself, I am a philosophy student and history student at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And I basically organize this along with Gabriele Sartoris, who is in the back, helping me. And the Salon seeks to really give the audience a chance to speak as well. So it's not a Q&A that comes up when the audience gets its turn to speak, and it's not a TED Talk, which is very important, I think, because it accords with the democratic traditions of Switzerland, which gives people a voice. So, the war in Ukraine, a very complicated issue. We may be seeing the birth of a new nation in Ukraine that's redefining itself under new principles, which is very significant because that hasn't happened in Europe for a very long time. And ever since it started last year, a debate has been raging fiercely about the morality of what happened. Is it illegal what Putin did? Is it immoral? Is it worse than a crime? Is it a blunder? All these questions have come up. Also about the causation of it. What caused it? When did it start? In 2020 or 2014? Opinions diverge on this as well. And then there's the question of the geopolitical implications of it. Not only are we seeing something that might engulf Europe and the world in a wider war, perhaps even an inferno of nuclear destruction, we are also seeing the breakup of the post-World War II order that has been established. Europe is not as united as we thought. Eastern Europe is definitely not in line with whatever Germany or France or Britain is trying to achieve. And then there's the question of the US that comes in, and the whole issue of NATO expansionism. But also, of course, Putin's, some might call it, dreams of rekindling the Russian Empire, which is, of course, the opposite number of expansionism, which some argue has been carried to megalomaniacal proportions. Then there's the issue of Swiss neutrality, which, as you might know, Zelensky spoke yesterday in Parliament. The Swiss People's Party walked out because they think neutrality is being disrespected by letting him speak there. And the Swiss government has just basically, the National Council has just freed up 25 Leopard 2 tanks to be basically, in effect, given to Ukraine, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but might be a bad thing for Swiss neutrality. So that's something to think about. And for the purposes of this debate, we have invited two eminent guests. I shall introduce them in the order they shall be speaking in, and when we wrap up, they shall be speaking in the opposite order. First, Mr. Zayas. Mr. Zayas is a US and Swiss citizen residing in Switzerland. He is the former secretary of the UN Human Rights Committee. He is also a former UN independent expert on international order. He is also a former chief of the petitions department at the office of the UN Chief High Commissioner for Human Rights. And currently he is a professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. He has a PhD in law from Harvard and a PhD in philosophy from Göttingen. He has been a visiting lecturer in various universities in the US, Canada, Ireland, Germany, Spain, and even Tunisia. He is the author of, I think it's now 13 books, 13, yes, including Building a Just World Order and The Human Rights Industry. By the way, those books are on the table there, and afterwards, after the show, you can buy them if you wish, and he will sign copies, which I encourage you to do. They're interesting books, and he's a good writer. Next, we have Frank Furedi. Frank Furedi is a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Kent. He is a prolific social commentator and also a man who has written over 25 books. His research focuses on the cultural developments that have been going on in Europe for the last, well, ever since the First World War, and even before that. He is a specialist on the issue of fear from a sociological perspective and has written books on the culture of fear, which is the title of the book, and other works in that vein. Also about paranoid parenting, and recently a book which is particularly germane to this discussion, which is about the war in Ukraine, called
How the West Lost Its Way.
Yes, The Road to Ukraine, How the West Lost Its Way. That is the book. And now I shall hand over to Mr. Zayas. 15 minutes.
15 minutes? Okay, let's time it. Ladies and gentlemen, as a professor of law, I may bother you with some paragraphs and articles. I'm a believer in the United Nations system. I'm a believer in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I'm a believer in peace. I've been a peace activist all of my life. I escaped the Vietnam War just by luck because there was a lottery. And out of 365 days, every birthday was pulled out. I got 313. So they only recruited until 287. And that's the baby boom years. By the way, I just celebrated my 76th birthday. So you can see that I was exactly in time to be recruited, to be drafted into the criminal Vietnam War. But as a professor of law, the important thing to know is that the United Nations Charter is the only rules-based international order we have. I can't stand hearing Antony Blinken saying rules-based international order because we have it. The only problem is that we in the United States do not live according to that rules-based international order. What Blinken wants is our rules are arbitrary rules that we want to impose on everybody else. But take the UN Charter. Article 2, paragraph 4 prohibits the use of force without approval of the Security Council, but it also prohibits the threat of the use of force. Now here we have a double whammy. You have a clear violation of international law by the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February of 2022. But as has already been mentioned by Andreas, this war did not start in 2022. It actually started in 2014 with what I would call a vulgar coup d'etat, a revolution that was co-financed by my government, and even Victoria Nuland, the then Undersecretary of State for Europe, told the Congress that it had cost us $5 billion to subvert the government through our many NGOs and other hands that were used in Maidan to topple the democratically elected government of Yanukovych. Now, I have no sympathy for Yanukovych, but I do condemn interference in the internal affairs of other states. Now, we have this event in 2014, which also has a prehistory, because as George Foster Kennan wrote in his legendary opinion piece in the New York Times in February of 1997, the idea of expanding NATO to the east and to the very frontiers of Russia was going to lead to war. I mean, it was contrary to oral commitments made by George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, by his Secretary of State, James Baker. All of this is actually laid down in the minutes of all these meetings that took place in 1989, 1990, 1991. And as you probably know, commitments made by heads of state and secretaries of state, even if they're only oral, they're laid down in the minutes and they are legally binding. So we broke international law. The United States breaks international law on a regular basis. It's not something that is so unusual. What is unusual is that Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden deny that these commitments were made when they are actually in the records. And these records have been declassified. So it's ridiculous, the position that we have taken. But let's go back to this Article 2, Paragraph 4, provocation. Of course, the so-called special military operation in the Ukraine violates international law. It constitutes the crime of aggression, etc. But there are also precedents of permissibility. It's not the first time that we see that. I mean, the United States engaged in unprovoked war against Vietnam and unprovoked war against Yugoslavia and Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Libya, and Syria. Israel, almost on a daily basis, sends drones or missiles against Damascus and Aleppo. All of these are breaches of Article 2, Paragraph 4. And all of that has been in total impunity. So that creates, it doesn't legalize it, huh? Because no right can emerge from a wrong. So there's no change in international law. But you have a situation that manifests the lack of enforcement mechanisms of the United Nations, and that has plagued the system since the very beginning. Now, what is crucial is prevention of war, prevention of the use of violence. And Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter provides that all differences should be settled peacefully through negotiation. And that is not only before the use of violence, the use of force, but also during. So the prolongation of a war, as we're seeing today, is actually a crime against peace, and it is a crime against humanity. People are dying this very minute, and this could have been ended last year easily. The proposals of Erdogan in March 2022 provided a good basis for ceasefire and negotiations, torpedoed by my government. A month later, the Israeli ambassador, Prime Minister Bennett, he also arrived at a plan for a ceasefire and negotiation, again torpedoed. Putin has said it 1,000 times. He wants to speak. He wants to sit down and negotiate. Zelensky is not allowed to do so. The United States has a strategy, and you can see that way back in the 1990s. If you remember Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, or if you ever read the Project for a New American Century of the neocons in the 1990s. I mean, the idea is the unipolar world And we Americans are the hegemon, and we're going to tell everybody else what to do. So things change in the world, and the Russians don't want this unipolar world. And they signaled again and again. You may remember the speech of Vladimir Putin at the Munich Security Conference in the year 2007. He already laid it out. He said, I mean, NATO expansion, and especially NATO encirclement, because it's not only the expansion, say, into Czechoslovakia or Poland, how about Georgia, the attempt to bring Georgia also into NATO and bring Ukraine into NATO? That is an existential threat. And as such, it is a violation of Article 2, paragraph 4, and actually entails a threat of international peace and security for purposes of Article 39 of the UN Charter. Now, what to do about all of this? Paragraphs are there, and they're violated with impunity. We hear in the gleichgeschaltete Presse, in the media, let's go and try Putin for war crimes. Of course, the Russian army has committed war crimes. There's no war in which the armed forces do not commit war crimes. But the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977 are very clear that the obligation to prosecute and to investigate the war crimes lies with each and every army. And that is where it's at. I am in favor of investigating and punishing war crimes, but not by another body. The International Criminal Tribunal has zero credibility, especially under the current prosecutor, who's an absolute disgrace, Imran Khan, a British national, a British barrister, who discontinued the investigation into war crimes by NATO countries in Afghanistan and Iraq, but did continue them with regard to the Taliban. I write about that in this book. As a matter of fact, the book Human Rights Industry could have had a different title. I could have called it, you know, Human Rights Monitoring Mechanisms, the Human Rights Protection System, or whatever. But why do I call it industry? Is because the donors are actually setting the agenda. And the think tanks are so penetrated that they are pens for hire. You just ask the Atlantic Council, or you ask the Council of Foreign Relations for a study on something, and of course they're going to do exactly what you want. They're going to write what you want. They're pens for hire. And you have a revolving door here system, also for Amnesty International and for Human Rights Watch, in which they go in and out of the State Department. You know, they have a position in the State Department, there's a change of government, you find them again in Human Rights Watch or in Amnesty International. And so you have to understand that the system has been corrupted, has been hijacked, and that they are essentially in the service of Washington and Brussels. So I see no hope there to solve the Ukraine crisis or the Ukraine tragedy. What I do want is that the media, the press, report about the root causes of the conflict. I mean, the simplification of the media, the, shall we say, garbage you read in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and in Le Figaro and in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. It's a disgrace that here in Switzerland, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung writes the nonsense that it writes every day. You can read Zeitfragen, You can read Zeitgeschehen in Focus, you can read Schweizer Standpunkt, you can read Roger Koppel and the Weltwoche. But even in the French-speaking Switzerland, where I live in Geneva, the Tribune de Genève is just as gleichgeschaltet as all the others, and they give you the same propaganda that you get from everybody else. So that is a problem, the information war, and we're losing it. The indoctrination is so intense that, you know, most people, they have other worries. You know, they have their families, their kids, and they're trying to make ends meet. So they're not going to go behind the story. They're not going to find, you know, that actually this war is a proxy war, that this war is a war that the United States is using, you know, till the last Ukrainian, in the idea that there's going to be regime change in Moscow, that they're going to weaken
You have 20 seconds left.
the Russian government to that extent. We'll pick up later, no problem. They say we can talk for hours and hours. And as I said, I am very interested in hearing Frank, because he'll have a different perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Frank.
I'm going to stand up because as a university professor, I'm used to standing up. Otherwise, nobody takes me seriously. So when the war broke out, I decided to visit Ukraine. I have a very strong emotional connection with that part of the world. And being Hungarian and experiencing the Russian invasion of Hungary in 1956, I almost felt an immediate empathy with the people of Ukraine. I didn't know why. So I went over to Transcarpathia, and then I went all the way up to what in Hungary is called Lemberg. It's called, Lviv. And the one thing that I learned almost the minute I arrived was that the people of Ukraine, almost everybody I met, were 120% committed to their national independence. And they were really united in a way that I've never experienced in my life, to kind of make sure that their nation was going to remain part and parcel of the world order. At that point, I decided to write a book, which was published last September. But when I wrote the book, I came to the conclusion that this is a typical frontier war, and frontier wars never end. They just go on and on and on. And the reason why they never end is because in this case, neither side can win the war, and neither side can afford to lose the war. I think it's as simple as that. When you look at the geopolitical situation, the stakes are so high. I mean, you could argue that Russia has already lost the moral war, and it's been it makes America's Vietnam look like a relatively pleasant experience for Washington, because the moral authority of Russia as a big power with a serious army has been seriously called into question. So that's already a reality. But losing a moral war is not the same thing as losing a military war, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So then I began to ask myself, what is really going on? And I was conscious of the fact that just before the war broke out, we had COVID. And almost overnight, everybody I knew became a pandemic expert. Everybody had strong views about the reason why the pandemic broke out, what was really going on. And I didn't want to become a Ukrainian war expert like that. Although now we have millions of them. I mean, everybody's got very strong views about Ukraine and has got special insights, all the stories that nobody knows about, which they discovered online. And you got the most grotesquely weird discussions going on about the causes and everything else. So I tried to take a bit of a step back and use my sociological and historical understanding to make sense of the world. And I came to the conclusion that essentially what we have in the war are three different wars. And unfortunately, these three wars interconnect, and they reinforce one another to create a very difficult situation. So the first war is essentially Ukraine's fight for national independence. It's a fight to preserve its sovereignty. And it's a war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that's what the war is. That's in general how it's presented. And it's a war where I think that anybody with democratic inclinations who believes in freedom has got no choice but to support Ukraine in that particular war. Because if we basically allow sovereignty of a nation to be casually pulled aside, then tomorrow it will be done in other countries as well. So it just basically, for me, that's a no-brainer, that this is absolutely necessary. The problem is complicated by the fact that this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia, because it was and always will be and continues to be a proxy war between America and Russia. And that proxy war between America and Russia isn't just about the two nations, it's also about reasserting the existence of NATO. I mean, NATO used to be a zombie organization. It really had no purpose after the Cold War. It was looking for a purpose. The invasion of Ukraine gave NATO a reason for existence. And not only that, the invasion of Ukraine allowed America, who had just suffered a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan, who looked like a global joke in terms of its geopolitical sort of projection, suddenly to come across as this friend of democracy that's going to protect the world from evil. And America, which was really in a very fragile position, suddenly found it possible to essentially mobilize Europe behind it. I mean, Germany in particular being an unusually craven country, who, when America says jump, Germany says high. That's the only way it can answer that. You had a situation where America was able to use this war in a way that has really benefited it. As one of the main beneficiaries of the war so far is America. The other one is China, but that's a different story altogether. These two countries have really benefited from this tremendously. So it's a proxy war. Thirdly, and this is never discussed, but something that I think is really important to grasp, it's also a culture war. It's also a war about cultural values. And it really hit me how much culture is implicated in this. When I went to Washington, D.C., and I was talking to some guys from the State Department, and we had a bit of an argument, and then they kind of were smiling. I said, why are you guys smiling? It says, oh, we just did this tweet. And the tweet said, let's queer Kiev. And I thought that was quite interesting. Let's turn Kiev into an LGBTQ colony in line with the American obsession with the rainbow flag. It's almost as if, the more rainbow flags you can plant in Ukraine, the more America has managed to morally and culturally dominate that kind of part of the world. And that's really important because the cultural issue is crucial for the West in that it's through culture that Western nations are able to legitimate themselves. It is through culture that you get this legitimacy to be seen as the good guy. And I would argue that for the West, the war in the Ukraine has become important because it's become a medium for morally rehabilitating what was otherwise a fairly fragile world order, which is why you have a situation where every second-rate politician from Macron to the German Chancellor schleps over to Kiev to take a picture. It's a photo opportunity with Zelensky. And you have this situation where they're kind of queuing up as to who's going to be taking the next shot. And what's really happening here is they're drawing on the moral authority of Zelensky, who really does have moral authority, who has really exercised leadership in a way that they haven't been able to, as a way of giving themselves some kind of credibility. So it's a threefold war that we're seeing here. Now, why has this happened? In my work, what I argue is that the source of the war is what I would call the Russia question. Now, what is the Russia question? The Russia question is the contemporary equivalent of what we used to call the German question. For those of you that know your history, you will recall that one of the reasons why Germany kept on getting into wars, First World War, Second World War, and other things, was because its place in the world was, in a sense, insecure Germany was too big to be just a local regional power within Germany, and was really trying to demonstrate that it was a big player, but it was also too small to be a global power, to basically compete with America on an equal basis. And the German question actually never got resolved until after the reunification of East and West Germany. Now we haven't got a German question, but we have a Russian question. And the Russian question is exactly the same. Because at the end of when the Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated, and you had a situation where Russia had to make its own way by itself, you had a situation where Russia suddenly felt that it couldn't just be a regional power, which is what it was, a strong, powerful regional power. It wanted to be a bigger player. And it couldn't really decide, and it couldn't decide for a variety of reasons, as to whether it was, because it too was too big to be just a regional power, but too small to play the role of a superpower that it was used to in the past. And I think that unresolved question is really one of the most proximate sources of the crisis in the area. I think that everybody in the world was complicit in it, because after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, instead of being able to give security guarantees towards Russia to make them feel relaxed that they were going to be able to exist without any kind of encirclement or pressure, people became rather casual and indifferent. And there's a long story of a number of mistakes that were made. And I think that as long as the Russian question exists, the war will continue. And it's not, people talk about the Ukraine side of it, but that's relatively, unless you're Ukrainian, that's relatively insignificant compared to the potential of the war breaking out on the eastern front of Russia. I mean, Russia, which was the most dominant power in the Caucasian and in the Central Asian areas, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, all these areas, lost its grip. Russia couldn't even defend Armenia when Armenia was attacked, right? Can you imagine that Armenia, which Russia has always guaranteed it would defend, had to turn to America to give it support, in a sense, in its battle with Azerbaijan and elsewhere. The Chinese have moved in, and the Turks and the Iranians have moved in, precisely into those areas where Russia used to have hegemony beforehand. So we are now seeing a very big problem. And the problem that nobody dares talk about is actually internal to the Russian Federation. Because don't take the stability of the Russian Federation for granted, given the fact that there are forces that are similar to what happened in Yugoslavia, all pulling in different directions. And if that goes, then the consequences of that will make the Ukrainian war seem like a relatively cool, laid-back affair. Right? So I think that needs to be understood. I think there are a number of contributing factors as to why this is happening. One of the main factors is what I call the geopolitical illiteracy that prevails in the West. I think in Western society, if you know anything about geopolitics, you'll know that, for example, in Western universities, the word geopolitics is now seen as a dirty word. The very idea that you want to defend your national interest is seen as something that people did in the interwar period. It's slightly nationalistic, it's almost fascistic. That's the way that it's seen. So geopolitics is kind of looked down upon. And as geopolitics is looked down upon, the people that are diplomats are no longer realistic about what they're doing. I mean, one of the things that I find really shocking is that in England, where I live, in the Foreign Office, most of the guys that work there don't speak a foreign language. I mean, it's unthinkable, right? You got these idiots who can barely speak English, sort of trying to make sense of what's happening in Egypt or in China. It was reported the other day that they only had 2 Mandarin speakers. Now, China is one of the most important players in the world. And if the British Foreign Office doesn't understand what they're saying, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And that's happened, by the way, in the State Department in the United States. Mm-hmm. And even in the Champs-Élysées in Paris, we don't have Talleyrand's anymore. We don't have Talleyrand's or Metternichs or even Kissinger's. I mean, Those kinds of people don't exist in the diplomatic sphere. So geopolitics is gone. The second thing that happened was that in the post-Cold War period, people said that national interests were no longer important. We live in a globalized world where what's really important are economic relationships, not political ones. And therefore, you had a situation where people became so interested in economics that they lost sight of the fact that geopolitics and political calculations still mattered. I know, for example, that in the literature, it was declared that conventional wars will never happen in Europe again. There's a big literature in international relations that says conventional wars are 19th century wars. They might happen in Syria or Libya or Afghanistan, but we're not going to have them in Europe.
1 minute, Frank.
And you look at the world now, and you'll see, of course, that conventional wars are very, very real.
That young man with
The last point I want to make is
the
this.
yellow hat.
I would love to see peace, and I think that peace is something that everybody in this room, despite all of our differences, really, really want. It's going to be very difficult to achieve this. If you look at the story of conventional warfare in the world, you'll find that when you have a conventional warfare between two countries that are next to each other, they last for a long time. Iran-Iraqi war, 10 years. I mean, that seems to be the average that wars like this kind of continue for. So don't expect this war to end anytime soon. But what I would suggest is that instead of taking hard and fast positions, and instead of blaming this and blaming that and just playing the blame game, we got to ask the question, what is it that we can do to create a peace that guarantees Ukraine its national independence so that the Ukrainian people feel that their independence will not be violated anytime soon? And what can we do to give Russia some security guarantees so that it doesn't feel encircled by the West? There are two important elements in any solution. They are difficult to bring about, but unless we manage to do that, the war is going to happen for a long time to come. Even your grandchildren may live through a next episode of a Ukrainian-Russian war. Thank you.
Yes, those were all very interesting points. Now, is this Mike? Yes, it works. So what we're going to do now is draw out a few things between our speakers, and then we'll come out to you for your opinions. So, well, I think that's actually a good question that Frank asked just at the end of his speech, which is how do we actually create peace? Because everyone seems to want peace. The only question is how to achieve it. Do we have a negotiated settlement via diplomatic intervention and mediation? Do we call up the Pope? Do we do it in Geneva? Or do we achieve peace by defeating Russia, which is also an option on the table, supplying Ukraine with arms? Which is what Frank said, I think, which is that we must stand with Ukraine, in his opinion, and supply it with the weapons it needs. Would you agree with that? Is that the way to achieve peace?
Well, I published a blueprint for peace back in December 2022. I have some 50 essays in Counterpunch. I suppose some of you have read Counterpunch. And my last one is on the issue of provocation. As the case may be, I would not share that point of view. I believe that the reason why we cannot have peace today is because the United States does not want peace today. The United States wants war. The United States is making a lot of money in this affair. We're selling weapons to everybody. Of course, we're getting also further and further in our $33 trillion national debt. In any event, my knowledge of American diplomats in Geneva and in Washington, D.C., and my knowledge of American politicians shows that they live in their own world, in their own bubble. They believe their own propaganda, and I see no hope that any meaningful peace initiative will come from the United States. Pope Francis has made reasonable proposals. The Brazilian President Lula, the Mexican President López Obrador, 5 African presidents have gone to Russia and Ukraine, trying to reach a negotiated peace. But if you wind this tape back to December 2021, and if any of you have had the opportunity to read the 2 treaties that Sergei Lavrov put on the table in December 21, a treaty between Russia and NATO and a treaty between Russia and the United States, that would have guaranteed the national security of Ukraine and the sovereignty of Ukraine, but it also would have guaranteed the right of self-determination. Now, I was the representative of the Secretary General for the elections in the Ukraine years ago, and I went, I crisscrossed the country. I mean, I went to Crimea and I went to the Donbass, etc. And it's no question that these people overwhelmingly are Russian and feel Russian. And you cannot discount that. The United Nations failed the Ukrainians and failed the Russians in 1991
20 seconds.
by not conducting referenda in 1991. They could have conducted referenda in 2014 after the coup d'etat in Maidan, and that would not have been any different than the results obtained in the referenda conducted unilaterally by the Crimeans and unilaterally by the people of Lugansk and Donetsk. And there's nothing special about unilateral referenda. Take the Algerian referendum on independence. Obviously it was not recognized by France. Obviously it was unilateral. And they had to swallow it because that was the reality. Thanks.
So, Frank, anything to add to that or disagree with?
Yeah, I see things a little bit differently. So the only thing that we agree on is that America doesn't want peace. I think that's true. But then Russia doesn't want peace either. I think it's weird to suggest that Lavrov's proposal, was a solution to peace, or that somehow Putin is a man of peace that is somehow thwarted by external forces. I think that's a weird representation. It overlooks the fact that in the real world, underground, it was Russian soldiers that stepped over the border into the Ukraine. And that's something that, you cannot deny. And that's something...
I do deny it.
Yeah, well, fine.
I have my sources.
Yeah, well, you have your sources and you can have your fantasies.
No,
I
have my sources.
Oh, yeah. So all that I can say is that, we can live in a parallel universe where Russians were peacekeepers, sort of with the best of intentions, going into Ukraine to save the people of Ukraine from themselves. You can have that version of events. The other version of events is that, for a variety of reasons, merely because Russia felt insecure, they invaded Ukraine to kind of work out a new kind of arrangement. And so the point that I would make is that there's a real danger of turning a very complex problem into a simplistic one where you have the good guys and the bad guys. Unfortunately, in this scenario, you have a lot of bad guys on different sides of the equation. And what I really kind of worry about is that if we don't see the situation in this particular way, then the prospects for resolving this are going to become very, very difficult. One of the things that I worry about is that now the situation has unleashed a dynamic which did not exist in March or February last year. The world today is very different than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
We have far more players being involved in this whole affair. It very much reminds me of what the world looked like, or may have looked like, before, in the decade leading up to the First World War, where people were setting up regional blocs and economic rivalries and political rivalries were kind of taking place. And under those circumstances, we are confronted with a reality that we have a new global environment within which most of the main players are both extremely short-sighted, but also very, very dangerous in the way that they're setting about doing business. And all that we can do under those circumstances is to begin to mobilize people, ordinary people in all the different countries, to try to create some kind of an anti-war momentum. And I think that the anti-war momentum that we want to create is one that is generously two-sided and doesn't really sort of decide to politicize the issue in a way that will be totally unhelpful. I just think that what I worry about is that at the moment everybody seems to know better than I do what's happening in the Ukrainian offensive. Everybody's got very good source of information about what's happening on the ground. Somehow they're really so much more informed than I am because they got their special sources that tells them what's really happening. And I actually think that's bullshit, essentially. I mean, that kind of wisdom that people seem to have acquired in all these ways is not true. War is complicated, and nobody knows exactly what's happening on the ground. I mean, it's impossible to know what's happening on the ground, and we should have the modesty to admit and to acknowledge that our ignorance of the dynamic is something that we should learn from rather than pretend that will just go away.
Well, that's very interesting. So the Zayas just clapped Frank for something he said. However, Frank just said he may be living in Fantasyland. And
Not maybe, he is.
He is living in Fantasyland and talking bullshit. And I have to let him come back for 2 minutes on that.
I didn't say he's talking bullshit. I think there is.
Oh.
I'm more generous than that.
Right, Fantasyland, but not bullshit.
As I said, I speak Russian, and I know both Russia and the Ukraine. I was also the representative for the Russian minorities in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and wrote several reports for the Security Council on that. So I know also the self-determination element here, the existential fear of the Russians of the Donbass and of the Russians of Crimea, who felt after the illegal coup d'etat that took place in Maidan, they felt threatened. And unfortunately, the Putsch parliament after the coup d'etat, instead of stretching out a hand and saying, brothers, we're all one, they adopted Russophobic legislation prohibiting the use of the Russian language, etc., etc. It's quite clear that the Russians in these areas felt threatened, and for that reason, cultural reason, it would have been appropriate for the United Nations to at least offer to conduct referenda. But I see another dynamic here, and it's the dynamic actually of a power in decline. The United States is no doubt in decline, and I have no doubt that in 10 years the world is going to be totally different, and the major players are going to be China and India. And as you know, BRICS is growing by leaps and bounds, and Egypt just asked to join BRICS, etc. I mean, we are auf der absteigende Ast. One last point that I want to say, because I've written that also. For me, as an international lawyer, NATO is usurping the functions of the Security Council, and because of the crimes committed by NATO forces in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya and Syria, crimes committed in total impunity, NATO qualifies as a criminal organization within the meaning of Articles 9 and 10 of the Nuremberg Statute, that is the London Agreement of the 8th of August of 1945.
And on that bombshell, we turn to the audience. Right, we have 2 microphones. Gabriele will be handing them out.
I think that young man over there with the
Yes?
yellow hat who wanted to take.
The man in the yellow hat. Right. So speak. Don't make it too long, but not too short either. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. You can speak twice. It's no problem. Sir?
Yeah, I mostly have a questions, if you don't mind to answer, but I can also explain my opinion. So in case, after the event, I'm a Ukrainian, by the way. Hi, everyone. So in case if you will be tired from Swiss-splaining and trying to explain Ukrainians what is happening in their country, feel free to come to me. We have like many groups of Ukrainians who can talk to you, and if you're really interested. So one of my questions is that Sweden and Finland recently, right after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, not a war in Ukraine, sorry, Russian invasion to Ukraine, started, they expressed the will to actually join the NATO. And maybe no one knows, but when Putin was asked what does he think about it, because I want to remind you, Finland is like right on the Russian border, and like Sweden and Finland joining the NATO means that Baltic Sea will actually become an internal NATO sea. So there is no other border except like NATO and Russia. So one of the journalists actually asked him what he thinks about it, and he said that he doesn't care because Sweden and Finland are independent countries, the same as Ukraine, I want to remind you, and they themselves can express their will whether they want to join the NATO or any other organization. So he didn't threaten them with war, no red lines were crossed for some reason. And yeah, missiles didn't fled to Finland, to Sweden, despite the fact that actually at that time they were still not a part of the NATO. And he could freely start the war, but he didn't do this. Okay, so I have one question, sorry for taking that long. So you said that like Erdogan and this like 100,000 African presidents and like everyone in the world are trying to make a peaceful agreement. Can you please name those points which are in this agreement? Except, of course, keeping Crimea and part of Ukraine as a Russian land. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Zayas will take a few points from the audience, and then you can come back on whatever you wish. Sure. So, anybody else? Hands up. You, sir, there. And then we'll take you, and then we'll take you, sir, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Yes, hello. You mentioned Brzezinski, and if I heard, Brzezinski was the idea that German technology and Russian oil would be the end of the USA, like that. So there was, for example, Schröder that wanted to make an oil deal with Russia, and his political career was suddenly over. And can you comment on the fact or on the naivety of the green parties now that just think we have a kind of, we make some solar cells, some windmills, some energy transition, and we have complete political independence from Russia? And how much this is a fact or a matter in this war?
Thank you. Good question. The man in the, I think it's a brown shirt.
My question is following, it's about Switzerland.
Oh, could you please speak into the microphone? We are recording this, so it would be nice to have your opinion public, yeah.
It's about Switzerland. I remember, read in the history books that Switzerland, during the time when there was the Soviet Union still, was a very neutral state. So maintaining absolutely the neutrality. And at the time, it was a fight between a capitalist, strong economic powers, and a communist, which finally was very weak economically. Now, Switzerland does not want to maintain its neutrality, but we have a fight between capitalist countries and upcoming stronger and stronger capitalist, economically strong countries. So I wonder, you should be neutral rather in the second case today than in the first case in the 1960s and 70s.
Right, thank you. The man over there wished to speak. So hand him the microphone. Yep.
Good evening. I have one question for Mr. de Furedi and one for Mr. de Zayas. Mr. Furedi, you mentioned rightfully that the lack of understanding of foreign languages is a big issue, obviously, in international matters. Extrapolating this situation to the war in Ukraine, what has struck me since the beginning of the war is how few people speak Ukrainian. And I found myself in this situation. I speak a little bit Russian, but unfortunately I don't speak Ukrainian. Do you think that's an obstacle to our understanding of what is going on? And then my question to Mr. de Zayas. Mr. de Zayas, you seem to place the conflict in the context of great power competition, but really what I've noticed is that the war started with a constitutional crisis. It's a problem of jurists. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm basing myself mostly on Wikipedia on this. But the war started when the agreement accord with the European Union was voted by the Parliament, by the Rada, but not signed by the President Yanukovych. Now, did he have the authority in the Constitution not to sign it or not? That's a very decisive question. And do you have an historical background over the Constitution of Ukraine?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Mr. de Zayas has grave doubts about the accuracy of Wikipedia. But before we get to that, Frank, do you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, so I was in Finland 2 weeks ago, and I gave a lecture in Helsinki and one in Tampere. And the thing that really struck me, I was shocked, is how scared people in Finland are. I mean, I was really shocked that they were, you know, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's right, but they are really, really scared of Russia. And the attitude towards Russia has fundamentally changed. I mean, in a way that is very difficult to describe, to the point at which a lot of people didn't want to speak to me because I'm Hungarian. And a lot of Hungary has got a different position on the war than many other Western nations. But I think that's telling that the minute that Russia invaded Ukraine, a certain dynamic was unleashed, which meant that it wasn't just simply Ukraine, Finland, who was prepared to change its foreign policy, but Switzerland. I mean, I always think that Swiss neutrality was a bit mythical. You know, when you scratch the surface, it wasn't as neutral as it seemed to be, but that's a different story. But the very fact that it could so casually basically change a very old practice indicates that the world has changed. And the reason why the world has changed was partially because of what happened on that fatal day. Now, I do think there's one point that I really want to insist on. It is true that the Ukrainians have been very silly in the way they treated the Russian minority. And they were very insensitive, and they should have given them language rights and been very generous in that respect. I feel strongly about that because they've done the same thing to the Hungarians in the Transcarpathian region, where for the first time, teaching Hungarian in schools is no longer allowed. Yeah. And they've torn down a Hungarian statue that's been standing there for a very, very long time. You know, so they are, you know, they've done things that are wrong, without any doubt about it. But the fact that they've done things that are wrong is not unusual in world politics. I mean, every nation does things that are wrong to its minorities. And that's not an excuse. Just because they've done things that are wrong to the minorities is not an excuse for somebody else to come in from outside and try to put things right on the ground that they defend. Because on the same ground, we would send people into Catalonia in Spain because the Catalonians feel about the Spanish pretty much the way that Russians in Donbass feel about the Ukrainians. And so we have to have a more kind of measured sensibility, because what I feel is happening is a creeping double standard that is being put in here, where you forgive sort of a bit of Russian aggression in a way you wouldn't forgive America saving Syria from itself. So I do think a balance is really quite important. in relation to this particular kind of stuff. I just think that especially Swiss people need to ask themselves how it has come to be that Swiss neutrality has gone. That ship is now sailed. It will never come back. I cannot imagine in my lifetime Swiss neutrality being returned, because the dynamic has been set in by something that is very, very important. And we need to be able to have a diagnosis and understand what was it that created this fear, this reaction, this recreation of this West that never, more or less was gone a few years ago, coming back to life in the way that zombies occasionally do from time to time.
Okay. Zayas, anything you wish to add?
Sure, well, I have to address 4 questions. And, first of all, why am I for negotiating, for mediation? Because I want to stop the slaughter. At this very moment, Ukrainian boys are being killed. Russian boys are being killed. This war should not even have started. One word would have saved it: neutrality. If Zelensky had agreed to neutrality, that would have ended the affair. The Minsk agreements, which unfortunately Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande went into in bad faith, as they have themselves confessed afterwards. And that, of course, is a violation of international law. You cannot go into a treaty not intending to implement it. As the case may be, the Minsk agreements did not provide for secession, did not provide for independence for Lugansk and Donetsk. It provided only for sitting down and discussing the other mode of self-determination, which is called internal self-determination. That is, you allow an autonomous status for the Russian speakers, if that's what they want. I'm not saying that you allow it because some leaders want that. You have to conduct a referendum, properly organized, properly monitored, to find out what people really want. But there's been a lot of bad faith here, because, to put it frankly, Putin was taken for a ride. To put it in German, he was verarscht. You go into a treaty, and the 2 major powers, France and Germany, were supposed to guarantee that treaty, go in just to gain time. That is criminal, nothing less than that. And as I say, my heart goes out to all these people who have been killed unnecessarily, when this matter could have been solved peacefully with the help of the United Nations. But as so often, the United Nations fails the world, fails the Ukrainians, and fails the Russians. Now, I very much, what you asked about the points, the Chinese 12-point peace plan has guarantees for the Ukrainian sovereignty, and provides, with regard to the territories in question, let the people decide. Let the people in Donetsk and in Lugansk decide what they want. Now, I know, having been there, that they feel very Russian. And of course, it's trying to regain these territories by force is as unrealistic as Serbia trying to reincorporate Kosovo into Serbia. There's so much hate because of the war. There's no way in the world that the Kosovars would accept being reincorporated into Serbia. And there's no way in the world that the Russian population of Lugansk and Donetsk would go back to Kiev. It's tragic,
20 seconds.
but that's the situation. Now, very quickly, as far as Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, I mean, I consider it, imperialistic gibberish. It's a mindset. It's a mindset that reminds me of Rudyard Kipling and the white man's burden. As far as Swiss neutrality, I am Swiss, and I very, very much believe in the necessity of Swiss neutrality. And I think that it's not gone. I think more and more Swiss are understanding. And the question is, how democratic are we really? That is the question that will now be put on a referendum. As far as a language, obviously, my representatives say being a double national, being an American and a Swiss. I know that most American diplomats speak English, period. They have no clue of other languages. They have no clue of other cultures, which is even worse. And I remember discussing this issue back in the early 90s with George F. Kennan, and he said to me that it is a disgrace how the State Department, the professionalism of the State Department is gone out the window. Thanks.
Very good. So, anybody else who wants to say something in the audience? Yes, we'll take you, and then we'll take you, sir, and then we'll take you, and then we'll see. We'll see.
Thank you. I have a question about to Frank. About Donetsk. I'm from Donetsk. I was born there. Then I moved to Kiev. And then this is where I'm here in Swiss. And my parents still in Donetsk, and I know situation in details. And I know, and I'm absolutely sure, and I can say that people from Donetsk and from Lugansk don't want to be in Russian. It's a manipulation about the language. These people in Donetsk and in Crimea and in Lugansk want to speak Russian language, not Ukrainian. Yeah, historically you are right, we are close to Russian war. But when these events begin in 2014, I think the war starts not in 2021, in 2014 war is start. The Russian propaganda will go, and will go faster and faster every year. And if you said that in 1991 the great mistake was to have elections, how to separate, yes, that Ukrainians want to join to Russia or don't want to join to Russia. In Ukrainians never want to go to Russia, in every region. Only, always the theme of big manipulation was the language, Russian language. That's why you can catch up all the Ukrainian and manipulate the brain of the Ukrainian. This was a big mistake, I think, for the Ukrainian government from the 1991, that we don't want to solve this problem, the language problem, and the reunion Ukrainian nationality. It's like a comment for you. The second situation, I want to, how do you think about the situation about Kakhovska Dom? Why UN don't react and don't do nothing about this ecology situation? Why do celebrate the Russian language, the language of the aggressive? How do you comment on the values freedom and value the equal nations of small and big nations in our world? Why you don't support the, okay, Ukraine in don't big country, but we want to be a freedom. We are democracy. And how do you think now for the Europe? I think it's challenge for every, and I agree with the Finland, with the Sweden. Yes, it's a challenge for all the European democracy, for all the European freedom.
That's a good point. So we have a disagreement about whether those regions wish to be part of Ukraine or not. It's very good. We should definitely discuss that. I think I said the man over there, yes?
I think we are living in a time of a change of an era, a Zeitenwende in Deutsch. And I think in times of Zeitenwende, it's always good to look at the big picture, because we have to decide, look, are we going to individual persons' opinions or strategic opinion? And this will be very decisive for Europe, because now we have 8 billion people in this world, and the so-called West has 15%. And I would like to add to your comment of the German question, there is also an Atlantic question from my humble point of view. Every 100 years, some people were visiting Russia. It was Karl XII, it was the Polish, it was Napoleon, it was Hitler, it was the Freeze, it was NATO. And every 100 years they come, and it's not clear. They have 3 conferences recently, how they divide up Russia. And you have indicated between the lines this would be a very good idea, because these little people, what are they doing there? It belongs to the West. Basically, we don't tell them now, these little conferences in Warsaw and in Prague, nobody talks about it. You can see on the map, they've even developed flags already. Flags. For each district where oil is a republic, where the most oil is a republic. And the master plan is not the Ukraine. Ukraine is completely uninteresting for the strategists. The master plan is to dismantle Russia and afterwards take China in an atomic war. And now this is the plan from your friends, from your Atlantic friends here, because you were sleeping very well the last 30 years here and play a double game and a triple game, and like in a poker, you know, you play on 3 tables at the same time. And now this double game will very soon end, because now I tell you the other scenario. There is a big danger for Europe now. The Europeans think they are double smart, sitting in the back and talking beautiful about peace and a little bit weapon here and a little bit money there. But listen, when the US will withdraw from Europe, the question will come, what happens to Europe? And I'm afraid if I see the level of intellectual 0.0, yeah, and what is happening, that Europe will be the big suffering from this final thing. But if they are not careful and continue this funny style now, that they are not coming on their own feet, behaving like a baby which is 4 years old and play triple and double games and think they are super intelligent. In reality, they are super full idiots. And they will see, in a few years, you will see what will happen to Europe if they continue this path.
Thank you, sir. Hand the microphone to the man over there. He will give it to you. And there was someone else who wanted to speak, other people. Which one was it, Frank? Can you point him out? Yes, then you, madam, and then, yes, you. And then we'll come back to the speakers and we'll go out again, I think.
My comments would be on 2 regards. First of all, it is somewhat upsetting in this setting to hear the argumentation of Swiss-splaining. First of all, because one of them is a Hungarian British who has nothing to do with Switzerland outside of coming here to speak to us. And second of all, for example, if I were to go to a man who happens to be a gynecologist, I find him to be more of an authoritative and knowledgeable source of information about the female reproductive organs than a 5-year-old girl, simply because she has a vagina. So saying that they do not speak about these, or trying to discredit their arguments and argumentations based on their nationality, which is only half or 1/4 correct because one is American Swiss, is a weak argumentation, I would say. As to something that I find very interesting about the public debates that take place, the media representation in general, and it was briefly mentioned. However, in my humble and maybe oversimplistic opinion, war is one of the worst things that humans can do to each other. Thus, I would assume that it ought to be reserved for the utmost existential threats. Within this realm, there's one argument that I hear often, which is so weird to me because the slippery slope argument is in actuality a slippery slope fallacy. It is not something that ought to be called upon in order to justify action, saying, if this happens, then that happens, then that happens, and then the whole world will go to an end. So we must, it would be optimal, I would say, to take the information on the table, not at face value, because we cannot assume that everyone is a fair player, but to take that information and make the best decision possible based on that, rather than saying, well, if we do this, then they're going to do that. Now, another part is,
Make it quick.
I will make it quick, I promise you. I completely understand, and I'm still learning about this more and more, but and this is something that I will definitely call on the man in the yellow hat on, because I'm certain that he will know significantly more about this than I do, but the trauma that exists from the post-Soviet collectivization and decolonization that has existed in that part of the world. Millions of people have starved to death in that part of the world due to the actions of their neighbors. Thus, we cannot also expect for them to be purely rational when it comes to the response to someone who within 1 to 2 generations did things to them that are amongst some of the worst things that have ever been documented.
That's good, sir. Yeah, we have to take into account the irrational and have some sympathy for it. And NATO expansionism would also be an interesting thing to talk about. I thought it was the woman over there. Yes, madam.
Hi, yes, I have a couple of questions. The first one is to Mr. Furedi. Thank you very much for the speech. Unfortunately, we were not able to listen to the whole one, but the question is, you're Furedi? Yes, I have the question to specifically. How do you think we can change the situation in Russia? Obviously, it should happen after victory of Ukraine, but how do you think this victory should happen? Is it only that Ukraine comes to the border of the officially recognized borders, or should Ukraine come to Moscow? And or maybe there should be separation in the elites of Russia or revolution. So how do you think we can change situation in Russia so that it's not imperialistic country anymore, that it's really democratic and capitalistic country? And the second question also to you is, how do you think Western society can work with propaganda, with Kremlin propaganda, which also work quite good here in Switzerland, because many people here really, they support Putin and they find some excuses for the war. So how do you think we can work with propaganda, which really significant here? And another question, very quick one, is to the second speaker. I actually have 2 questions to you. The first one is just a comment. No referendum would work because imperialistic countries, they should stay in 20th century. And it's not the way how countries should behave in the future. And the second question to you, how much did Putin pay to you? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, and I think that's a good point, because not because it's valid or not because it's true or whatever. That remains to be, we'll be skeptical about whatever is said in the Enlightenment tradition. Question everything. However, you don't only ask questions. If you want to say what you think, say what you think. If you have actual criticism to level against one of these 2 speakers, do it. We want to hear from you. Don't hold back with your critiques. Free speech allowed. I think it was the man over there, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you for first of all for the interesting discussion. I really enjoyed your inputs. I don't want to bore you. I have a question on the political side of it. Is it suspicious that after Merkel is gone and the new Chancellor of Germany comes in, then everything goes a bit downwards? And because I think that Merkel was more or less like the last kind of a big leader in Europe, shall we say. And now I think that Europe is just drags on with USA. Whatever USA says, Europe goes. We had like the explosion of Nord Stream, and this will be like maybe an energy crisis in the coming years. And also on the financial side of it, what do you think of the role of the Middle East in the new emerging world, shall we say? Because I think if I have understood it correctly, Saudi Arabia and the whole oil production, I think they favor Russia, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, about the prices and the production of the barrels and stuff like that. So yeah, I think I'm good. And yeah, thank you again for the interesting discussion.
Pleasure. I just want to state for the record that no one on this panel, including me, is funded by Putin or Russia. I think that's not an evidence-based accusation or suggestion. But we'll let the Zayas come back on anything he wishes to come back on.
Well, I've had worse things thrown at me. I've had death threats because of my reports on Venezuela, for instance, my report to the Human Rights Council. I was the first UN rapporteur to go to Venezuela in 21 years. And since I was not singing the song that they expected me to sing, not only did I get accusations, how much did you get paid by Maduro? And how much did you get paid by Diaz-Canel of Cuba to write what you're writing? And I got death threats. As the case may be, addressing the first question, because I have much respect for those who are victims, and you are a victim, and your family is a victim of this war. And again, I have a lot to learn on the situation in Donetsk and Lugansk. All I had is my experience having been there as monitor of elections, the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections years ago. So my knowledge is limited, but I am a great believer in self-determination. And without a doubt, since 1945, there have been a tremendous number of wars that found their origin in the unjust denial of self-determination. And the Human Rights Committee just condemned Spain because of its actions against the Catalan independence leaders. I personally, the same as in the Donetsk, I don't say that the Catalans should have independence. I just say that they're entitled to freedom of expression, and one eminent freedom of expression is a referendum how they want their children to live. And I must say, having studied I'm far more familiar with the Spanish Constitution than I am with the Ukrainian Constitution. Spain has violated its own constitution by denying self-determination, which is Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it's for all peoples, not just for the peoples you want to give it to. Now, as far as the blowing up of the dam of Kakhovka, now,
1 minute.
Yes, there I must say I've read quite a bit about it, and I always ask the question, cui bono, who benefits from this? And Ukraine definitely benefits more than Russia. And that being said, I rather point the finger at Ukraine and not at Russia. Let's be investigated. I am very much in favor of a clear investigation, as I am in favor of an investigation of Nord Stream. And I think that I know personally Seymour Hersh, and I correspond with him often. And the Seymour first scenario seems to me the most persuasive. Now, blowing up a dam is a crime, violates the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and indeed violates already the prior conventions, the Hague Conventions of 1909. And I was just thinking in 16-17 May 1943, Squadron 617 of the RAF Bomber Command, later called the Dam Busters, bombarded the Möhne and Edersee dams, causing thousands of civilian deaths, including an estimated 1,000 prisoners of war, mostly Ukrainian.
Okay, Frank, anything you want to come back on?
Yeah, so there's a few things I don't like. So in your comment about trauma, I do think there's a danger of projecting our Western medicalized view of the world on the rest of the world, and that kind of psychologizing, which is very, very common, certainly in Britain where I live, basically treats people in East and Central Europe as their moral inferiors, because we use a psychological language to somehow imply that unlike the Swiss or the British, who are so rational, these people over there, because of the suffering that they've experienced, are traumatized and are not capable of making calculating decisions. I think Ukrainians and Russians and all the people in the area have got the same intellectual resources as we have in the West. Yes. And I don't think that we should use the language of victimhood either, because that denies them their agency and their capacity for making things happen. And the thing that I find quite inspiring about, probably the only thing I find inspiring about this war, is seeing the Ukrainians that I know all of a sudden feeling that they've arrived. I mean, they really feel that they've arrived. They get this kind of sense of strength, even though we argue with each other about a lot of other stuff. So that I think is really an important point to park. The propaganda that you raise is a problem, but then I think propaganda comes from all sides. So I run a think tank in Brussels. I have to read around 9 or 10 newspapers every morning just to have a glimmer that maybe I'm getting the truth or something approximating the truth. Because obviously in a war, all sides present the war in accordance with their interests. That's normal. And I think that obviously there is a lot of propaganda that kind of comes our way. But you and I can, after a while, pretty much know what they are. There's a certain sets of messages that benefit Putin. There are certain sets of messages that benefit Ukraine. I mean, that's the way these kinds of things work. And we as mature, intelligent individuals have got to learn to read critically. That's really quite important for us. I agree with you that people don't want to join Russia.
1 minute.
That's obviously the case. The point I really want to make is that the idea of self-determination or autonomous self-determination is bizarre. Because by that logic, virtually every country would have a referendum tomorrow. And what we're doing is we're deflecting from the fact that somebody has invaded another country by morally making that equal to the need for a referendum. I think that we've got to be a little bit more objective in that, and we understand we live in a very difficult world. And it's not our job to tell others what to do, when to have a referendum and when not. To me, the rules-based United Nations system, I think, has got a lot of problems with it. I think they make up the rules as they go along very, very often, and they get to decide. So in the European Union, there are referendums which Brussels just then ignores. You can have Switzerland, you have a referendum which just gets ignored. So I think.
Really? I mean, Switzerland, the referendum do mean something.
He's referring to the Masseneinwanderungsinitiative.
Yeah. That one.
So basically, I think we just got to have a kind of a reality check, and it's for that reason that I don't tell you what Russia should do, because I think it's up to the Russian people to sort the problem out. Because the minute you and I intervene in Russia, we make the situation much worse, and we know that from every time America intervenes in Libya or Syria or anywhere else, it makes the situation far worse. For me, it's Yugoslavia that I always think about, and the horrible dynamic that it's unleashed. And I don't want that to happen to Russia, because that will be bad for everybody, not just the Russians, but everybody that lives in that region.
Very good points, I think, from both speakers. So let's take more points from the audience. I think we'll make this oh my God. Okay. unexpected. So who hasn't spoken yet? You, sir, haven't spoken yet, I think. Then the person beside you. Then the person at the back. And then we've got people back here, maybe, who wish to speak. Wow. You, sir. Yes? Right.
Thank you. Maybe my comments come too early, but we've been through a lot about understanding the reasons, how it happened, why it happened. But at the end, the practical question which concerns me is what is actually going to happen and what we would like to happen. And unfortunately, from many European leaders and Americans, I hear the same message: we cannot afford to let Russia win. Then the next logical step means that Russia must lose. So it's just pure logic. So then I'm just trying to understand how that would be actually possible and how would that happen, since Russia, as it seems, has nuclear weapons which is recently placed in Belarus. So and the way how this has been unfolding in the past year or past months is the way of escalation. And being in Europe, living in Europe, although ethnically I'm from, that part of the world, but that was a long time ago, I'm really concerned, because we seems to not looking, it seems we don't have courage to look in this abyss, what actually happens if the situation continues. So my feeling is that there is no alternative to peace negotiations, and the sooner this started, the better.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry, we have to keep it short now because time is running out. Yes, madam.
I want to question the narrative that Russia wanted to expand and wants to be a world power. Which facts speak for this projection? And the other narrative is that the Russia wouldn't recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. What do we have as facts that this is the case? Have there been any statements from Russia, any actions that would, before the war, that we speak before the war?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. The man behind her, yes?
Thank you, both gentlemen. I have two questions, related questions, about NATO expansion or agreement, or there are different opinions, okay? And then what happened to diplomacy in the world? Was it like developing over there from, let's say, if you take from the time Cold War time and today, so, or there is different diplomacy in the West and in developing countries? What is your opinion?
Very good. Now, I think over here we had lots of people who wanted to speak. The man there, yes?
Yes, I feel that both of the speakers, of course, Professor Zayas more so, work on the assumption that Russia wouldn't invade, Putin wouldn't do what he did, if they wouldn't feel threatened. And not because of some imperial dream or the threat of losing influence in that area, right? Because, there is also this, so when I've watched hours of Russian propaganda during last year, and the picture there is not about NATO that much. Of course, we are fighting with NATO, we are fighting with 50 countries, but most of the messaging is about Ukraine not being a real nation. Ukrainians are just confused Russians, basically, and in the face of such messaging that Ukrainians are facing. Speaking about the security concerns of a nuclear power, the threat is pretty abstract for them. Yes, NATO is kind of encircling it, but there is nothing remotely close of preparing for an invasion. Russia is nuclear power. That would be a stupid thing to do for NATO. Anyway, right? We don't want a nuclear war. But Russian neighbors, like I've been to Lithuania today. I'm from Poland. I know a bunch of Ukrainians. Professor was speaking about the Finland, who is also fearing Russia. They have a real visceral fear of Russia, and it's rational, I think. And I feel that both speakers being pretty much sure that if there was an agreement before that, for example, the NATO infrastructure would be removed from Poland, from Baltic states, and Russia would just be happy about it and not just invited for more violence. Because the way I see it is that Russia didn't invade Baltic countries, didn't invade Poland because they were part of NATO. So NATO actually served its purpose there.
Okay, so we don't want a nuclear war. That would be the end of the world. However, this discussion does have to come to an end, so I'll press the nuclear button. But before we do that, does anyone still want to speak? Anybody still have points? Yes, man in the back, then the sir, and maybe, yeah, why not? You can also speak twice for the last round.
Yes, thank you. So my question is pretty short. I heard that in Latvia it will be forbidden to speak Russian, and the Russian-speaking people there are, is what I understand, forced to speak Latvian, I think. And so my question is, do you see such situations with Russian-speaking people in other countries escalate as well? Like I can imagine, like if somebody hears someone speaking in Russian, like neighbors that used to speak Russian all the time, and then there's some extremist of some sort that's like, hey, there's a law, you shouldn't speak, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, this is how fights start in war. So, yeah, will this escalate or?
Okay, keep it short. Last comments. Two people there, I think. First, the guy in the back.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I just want to ask Mr. Zayas again a very clear answer, because I think you answered it, but not very clearly. Do you think Ukraine has broke its own constitution in 2014? Yes or no? Yes. What article?
No, I cannot give you the article. I mean, I'll give you the articles of the Spanish Constitution violated.
The Ukrainian Constitution.
I'm convinced because I looked at it at some point, but I don't remember now the article. Come on.
All right, settle the point. The man in front, immediately in front. Well, he might come back to it. He might come back to it. Just.
Yeah, just really quick about the self-determination. Soviet Union attacked Finland twice during World War II when they annexed eastern parts of Finland. Should we not have a referendum there to determine self-determination for those areas of Finland that were annexed out?
Okay, so really, anyone who hasn't spoken yet, perhaps? Can I see hands? Right, the man here, last word, and then we'll come back to the audience. Or, actually, yeah, go ahead, sir. We've got falling things, yeah.
I got the impression, so everybody's trying to say, this is the article, and this is the UN article that you violated. Come on, we are playing here realpolitik. And we are dealing with a nuclear power, and we will have to do the same thing with China. We have to play realpolitik and not looking on some article somewhere in the constitution. This is bullshit at the end.
Okay. Did the man in the yellow hat also want to say something? Because he started, he might as well finish.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not? Brief.
I have so many points, but yeah, I will try to be super short. One question to both of you. So you said that Ukraine or NATO or United States or, I don't know, LGBT mutants provoked Ukraine. Oh, no, sorry, provoked Russia. May I ask you, what could provoke you to kill a man? Your neighbor. So him buying a new car, him, I don't know, speaking with your wife. What could provoke you to killing a man? And quick quick note, which probably will turn all the Swiss back on me, but is neutrality actually means trading with Nazi Germany during the World War II? Is neutrality actually means selling weapons and military components to Russia, despite the fact that they actually block German tanks, which actually belong to Germany, and like all the equipment which belongs to Germany, from being sold to Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, that's very good. Now, Frank, please.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm not a fan of neutrality, but that's a different story. I think neutrality is a privilege that some countries, usually very rich countries like Switzerland and Sweden, can afford.
Ireland is very poor at that.
Yeah, well, Ireland has become a colony of the European Union, so it can, its neutrality is more apparent than real. I think the idea of what would provoke me to kill is a really stupid question, because provocation is something that happens in the moment. People who think about something are not provoked. That's a very different dynamic altogether.
Mm-hmm.
I've never said that somehow Putin was kind of just provoked, and that is very pacifist kind of government. I think that what I was arguing for is that there was a global dynamic in place whereby the security concerns of Russia, and they are genuinely security concerns, you have to remember that Russia is a very insecure power. It's a power that's fought internal wars ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a status quo power. I don't think that there's a big ambition on its part to expand, but it has expanded for a variety of reasons. So it's set up bases in Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere. But I do think that we are trying to find black and white answers to something that is a result of a chain of events that have been unleashed, and of which Russia is the most guilty party because of its invasion of another country. But actually, reality is a little bit sort of more complicated than that. I mean, Latvia, you see, we've got to be very careful. I mean, Latvia, what it's doing to the Russian minority is horrible. I don't know who asked that question, but Lithuania is pretty much doing the same. And even Estonia is not exactly honorable in the way that its Russian minority is treated. And that is, to me, a real cause of concern. And I've talked to a lot of Russians who feel that they've been dispossessed of their citizenship because of that. But because Russians are treated so badly in these Baltic states, does not have no bearing upon the war that we're kind of fighting. In other words, there's no justification for that. And at the same time, Russia cannot use that as an excuse for its own behavior in Ukraine itself. So I do think that what I'm really sensing that's going on here is that we're trying to find false arguments to support our sides. We're using a double standard. That certain things, are okay because the other side is doing it. All of a sudden, if you take that kind of logic, then, the whole war happens because NATO gets up one morning and decides that it wants to expand and become strong. It doesn't work like that. Right? You've got to make, a long time ago, the Greek historian Herodotus made a distinction between what he called the immediate cause of the war and the real cause of the war.
Yeah.
Right? And the immediate cause of the war is Russian aggression. Right? That's the way it is. The long-term cause of the war is due to a number of complicated factors to do with the way in which the ending of the Soviet Union was managed kind of globally. And we need to make that kind of distinctions and not excuse anybody overall. And I like what you said about realpolitik, because at the end of the day, we need to have a strong sense of realpolitik rather than simply sort of rely upon paper resolutions that are not worth the paper they're written on, to imagine that if you're going to rely on the United Nations to defend you, then you're in deep shit, basically. I mean, that's all I can say, because the United Nations has a formidable track record of abandoning people in trouble on a regular kind of basis. At the end of the day, as we saw during the pandemic, It was national governments that looked after their people. It wasn't the World Health Organization, it wasn't the United Nations or the European Union, it was the sovereign nations and sovereign governments that did the business. And that's the lesson that we should draw also from the war here, which is why, to me, the whole debate, the whole issue boils down to where do you stand on the question of national sovereignty. That's, to me, the most inviolable principle of all, and it's the one that we should take most seriously in this very interesting discussion that we just had.
Thank you. You have 4 minutes plus.
Thanks. On the 10th of June, 1963, John F. Kennedy held a lecture that I think you should consult. You can get it in the internet. It's in the JFK archives. And he said very clearly that in the nuclear world, you cannot put a nuclear power between the choice of humiliation or using the nuclear weapon. Now, I don't see any possibility of Ukraine ever coming to Moscow. If Moscow felt itself existentially threatened, they will definitely use the weapon as we Americans used it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we started the problem. As the case may be, Kennedy and Khrushchev back in 1962 solved the Cuban Missile Crisis through a quid pro quo. The Russians took the missiles out of Cuba, the Americans took the missiles out of Turkey, and they made an agreement not to intervene again in Cuba. So everybody was happy. I think Ukraine deserves a quid pro quo. Now, as far as the narrative of Russia wanting to expand, there's zero evidence of that. Zero. I mean, I've looked into it. I'm a historian. And I've looked into the sources of the First World War, sources of the Second World War, and I can tell you history books are storybooks. As the case may be, the two treaties that Lavrov put on the table, I've read them. They're UN Charter anchored. They're very moderate. That would have prevented the war. And I think prevention is our main concern. We're dealing with a nuclear power. Now, the Security Council yesterday adopted Resolution 2686, a very good resolution on issues of prevention and issues of stopping xenophobia and incitement to hatred. Now, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, unfortunately also Le Figaro and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and die Zeit and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung have been engaging in vulgar Russophobia for the last 20 years, long before Maidan. I remember the ridiculous, really humiliating things that they wrote about the Sochi Olympics in February 1914. I mean, they are building a caricature of Putin as they built a caricature of Saddam Hussein and a caricature of Assad and a caricature. You have to hate them. So we engage systematically in hate speech. We engage systematically in making it possible so that the people will accept the fact, well, he's such a bad man, we have to take action. Now, what happened to diplomacy? There are some good diplomats. Jack Matlock in the United States, he's written extensively on the Ukraine war. Von Donani in Germany, he's also written. But for me, it's important that you understand that the realization of self-determination of peoples is not only the fact that it's jus cogens, it's Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is binding. It's been confirmed by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion on Kosovo, paragraph 80 of it, which contrasts self-determination and territorial integrity, and gives the preference to self-determination. Now, whether you like it or not, Kosovo created a precedent. Kosovo is a watershed. Since Kosovo, the Catalans have the same right to self-determination as the Kosovars and the people of Donetsk and the people of Crimea also. As I say, it's paragraph 80 of the advisory opinion of 2010. We are suffering, of course, through fake news, fake history, fake law, fake diplomacy, and fake democracy. One of the best books in the field is this one in French by Jacques Beau, Gouverné par les fake news. He does an analysis of the Russophobia against Russia. He does an analysis of the mobbing, of the media mobbing of all of the rivals of the United States, where we want to have regime change. And as far as Latvia, I told you I was the representative in 1992-93. I wrote the reports for the Security Council. I must say the Russophobia in Latvia was disgusting. And I was very sedate in my reports. I very much differed with the European parliamentarian Danelius, who wrote also a report extremely favorable to Latvia and extremely favorable to Lithuania and Estonia. I tried to remain as balanced as possible and say these are human beings. The Russians are human beings, as the Latvians are, as the Lithuanians are, as the Estonians are. They also have a right to exist, and they also have a right to exercise their language. And I must say, the resolution adopted by the Security Council yesterday, 2686, is extremely relevant because it's exactly against this kind of incitement to racial hatred, which is being practiced all over. And as far as realpolitik, I think that was an important point to make. It deserves repeating. We are playing with fire, and we have to stop the slaughter now. And we cannot continue escalating and continue expanding this war, because sooner or later nuclear weapons are going to be used. And if nuclear weapons are used, China will come into the game also, and India will come into the game, and that's the end of humanity. I mean, so don't underestimate the dangers that we, rather our democratically elected leaders like Joe Biden, are putting us into. Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, please thank our speakers, who have done a great job tonight discussing. And thanks also to all of you who have come here tonight to express your points of view and give these guys a hearing, as well as members of the audience. Now I think we've all earned ourselves a drink. So we'll go to the bar afterwards. For anybody who wants to stay, you can ask our speakers anything you like at the bar. They'll be ready to take your questions and points and have discussions with you. Don't forget the book signing over there, where you can buy Alfred's books and have them signed. And as for the Zurich Salon, we are on Patreon now, which you can ask us for if you want any details on it, or go on our Twitter and Facebook. And also, this hat does serve a purpose. You can actually place donations in it right over there at the table at the entrance, if you like. And we'll be doing more debates at the end of the year, in the second half of the year, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So if you're not yet on the newsletter, get on it. So again, thank you very much.
Can